Can Grover convince his pledge signers to not give in, no deal, no matter what the consequences to the economy? Jessica Yellen is CNN's chief White House correspondent. Mark Preston is CNN's political director. Kevin Glass, managing editor at townhall.com, a conservative political outlet and the author of a new piece published in The Atlantic. The loophole in Grover Norquist's anti-tax pledge is what it's called. Mark, let me start with you. A majority of Americans, this is fact. People are tired of me saying it. I'm tired of saying it to people. A majority of Americans support raising taxes on the rich. But everybody's taxes go up if Congress doesn't get a deal. Many Republicans are now stuck between this pledge they've made to Norquist and this real threat of everyone's taxes going up and the attendant effects on the economy. How much power does Grover Norquist wield right now in this environment?
Look, he clearly wields power, but he doesn't have absolute power, and I think Steve Ratner is right. You know, the invincibility of Grover Norquist, I think, has been overblown by us in the media, quite frankly. You know, this tax pledge isn't necessarily with Grover Norquist as it is with taxpayers in the state that voted for a lot of these conservatives who signed the pledge. But I think it's foolish for us to think that there isn't going to be a deal cut. We don't know what the deal will be. I think it's foolish to think that anyone wants to have their legacy to be that they drove us off of the fiscal cliff. We're just in the political dance right now, Allie. We've seen this time and time again. There's still three weeks for a deal to be cut. The problem is that the White House threw down a very heavy marker yesterday, and we'll have to see if, in fact, they're willing to compromise. It's got to be compromise on both sides.
Right, and that marker they threw down, Kevin, is that the White House says actual tax rates, the top tax rate, 35%, has to go up for the rich, and that limiting deductions won't be enough to get a deal. Now, you wrote in The Atlantic this week that despite that, there's a way around this for Republicans who don't want to incur the wrath of Norquist or, as Mark suggests, voters. How?
Right, so the Grover Norquist pledge is actually incredibly misunderstood. It's based on what Washington budgeting organizations call the current law baseline. And what that means is that what's scheduled to go into effect already is baked into the cake. And because the Bush tax cuts are expiring provisions that were voted for 10 years ago, it doesn't really count as a tax hike when they're already, you know, scheduled to take effect. So as long as Republicans can just keep the revenue below what taxes would raise to in full expiration of the Bush tax cuts, they won't be violating the pledge.
Kevin, that sounds incredibly reasonable. Do you think Grover Norquist shares that interpretation?
Well, so there's an important distinction to be made between what the pledge actually says and what Americans for Tax Reform, his activist organization, advocates for. As Grover has said himself, the pledge is to the American people, not to Grover Norquist. So it's not just, you know, Republicans need Grover Norquist's approval for what they want to do. It's more that Americans for Tax Reform wants to keep tax rates low, despite the fact that legislation says they're just going to go up no matter if Congress doesn't do anything.
All right, so a compromise is going to require more than finding Republicans who are willing to break with the Norquist anti-tax pledge. The GOP wants to know what the Democrats are going to be willing to give up in the form of spending cuts.
Despite the claims that the president supports a balanced approach, the Democrats have yet to get serious about real spending cuts.
Jessica, the president ran and won on a promise to raise taxes. I mean, what a different scenario, Jessica. A year ago, you and I were talking about how this election was all going to be about jobs, and then both campaigns made exactly the same promise about job creation, so that almost got off the table, and it all became about taxes. He doesn't have to run for office again, as you've stated before. Could we make the case that in order to get a deal, the president should just put forward a big proposal to cut the size of government that is significant enough to give Republicans the cover they need to agree to a deal that would meet that red line that you pointed out that means raising tax rates? Is there a win-win for the president here?
The win-win is, sure, it's finding the middle ground, but the dynamic, as you point out, has changed, Allie, and it's clear that Washington hasn't accepted that the dynamic has changed. It hasn't fully settled in. As you point out, the president ran and won on a promise to raise taxes. The president will not back down from that, and Republicans on Capitol Hill are still not accepting at this point that rates will go up. And that is the dividing line at this point.
All right, so that's That's the problem on the Republican side. One of the things that I really stick to that you have said in the past is, boy, you and I would both love if everybody involved would just tell the truth. Now, a lot of Republicans have said that the White House and the president are not telling the truth, that you can only achieve about $1 trillion over 10 years with this increase in tax rates to the top 2%. That means 3/4 of that $4 trillion goal that the president needs has to come from somewhere else, and he's not saying where from.
But they've also made it clear, well, first of all, they've said that they're willing to do $400 billion in Medicare and other entitlement savings.
That's true.
And they've also said that they're willing to be flexible beyond that. Now, they won't talk about the numbers with us in the press and the public. We all know they won't negotiate in public, but they have said, and I've asked them point blank, will you go beyond what you're, essentially, will you go beyond that? And they've said, yes, we're open to negotiating. So the bottom line is they've indicated that they are willing to do more than that they're willing to open up basically what they were talking about during the debt talks. You know, it comes to changing eligibility ages for some of these entitlement programs, raising, changing the caps, you know, indexing for inflation, et cetera. They'll do it, but they want to start talking numbers with Republicans. So, yes, they're willing to do more cuts, but they want the Republicans to agree on revenue first. And they're emphatic that the Republicans aren't willing to talk about the revenue, and so they can't start the negotiations. And this offer this week, or not even offer, but these numbers they came out with this week, were an effort to try to prod some sort of specific discussion of numbers.
It's a remarkable game of chicken. I'm quite happy that they don't do the negotiations in public. Doesn't matter to me as long as they're going on somewhere. Jessica, thanks very much. Jessica Yellens, our chief White House correspondent. Kevin Glass, managing editor at townhall.com. And Mark Preston, my good friend, is CNN's political director.